Being a soldier in World War I? Horrible. You were stuck in a trench, dodging bullets, eating moldy bread, and praying you wouldn't get hit by a gas attack. But being a medic? That was even worse. You weren't just fighting to stay alive, you were trying to keep others alive too. And guess what? You had no proper medicine, no antibiotics, and half the time, no anesthesia. That meant when a soldier got his leg blown off, you had to amputate it while he was awake. When someone had a bullet in their chest, you had to dig it out with bare hands and a dirty knife. And if that wasn't bad enough, the trenches weren't just battlefields, they were disease-ridden death traps filled with mud, rats, and the smell of rotting corpses. So yeah, being a medic in World War I, it sucked. You weren't just dealing with wounded soldiers, you were dealing with a never-ending nightmare. Before we get to the part where medics were literally chased by rats and drowning in mud, let's go back to how they got into this hell in the first place. Most medics in World War I didn't volunteer, they were forced into it. If you had any kind of medical training, congratulations, you were now responsible for keeping thousands of soldiers alive with barely any supplies. And if you didn't have medical training, too bad. The Army would give you a few weeks of training, maybe teach you how to wrap a bandage or stop bleeding, and then throw you straight into the trenches. There were no fancy hospitals, no sterile operating rooms, no high-tech equipment. You had to perform surgery in bombed-out buildings, makeshift tents, or sometimes right there in the mud. And the worst part? No one respected medics. You weren't carrying a gun. You weren't fighting. Some soldiers even saw you as a coward until they were the ones begging you to save their lives. But once you stepped onto the battlefield, all of that changed. Because the trenches, they were hell on earth. Imagine standing in waist-deep mud surrounded by rotting corpses with giant rats crawling over your feet. That was life in the trenches. And for a medic, it was nonstop chaos. Soldiers were being hit by machine guns, bayonets, and mustard gas. Artillery shells tore men to pieces, leaving nothing but shredded bodies for medics to drag out of the mud. The smell? Unbearable. Blood, rotting flesh, and trench foot, a condition so bad that toes would literally fall off. And then there were the rats, huge, disease-carrying, and everywhere. They didn't just run across your feet, they ate the flesh of dead soldiers. Some got so big that soldiers swore they could drag body parts away. And if you were a medic, you weren't just trying to patch people up, you were trying to keep yourself from going insane. Because every day, you had to listen to men screaming in pain, knowing you had no way to help them. And that's when you learned the worst truth of all. Most of the men you treated, they weren't going to make it. But you had to try anyway. And if you thought the trenches were bad, just wait until you hear what surgery was like. Here's the brutal truth. There was no anesthesia in most battlefield hospitals. That meant when a soldier needed surgery, he had to feel every second of it. Amputations? Done with a saw and no painkillers. Bullet wounds? Dug out with bare hands and dirty knives. Soldiers would bite down on rags, scream into pillows, or pass out from the pain, but medics couldn't stop. If they hesitated, the next patient would die waiting. And infections? Everywhere. Medics didn't have antibiotics, so even a small cut could turn into gangrene, forcing them to cut off a limb just to save a life. Sometimes soldiers woke up during surgery. Others, they begged medics to just let them die because the pain was too much. So yeah, being a medic, it wasn't just hard, it was pure torture. And if that wasn't bad enough, medics weren't safe from the enemy either. In most wars, medics are protected. They wear red crosses. They're not supposed to be shot at. But in World War I, that rule completely ignored. Snipers deliberately aimed for medics. Why? Because taking out the medics meant more wounded soldiers would die. That meant if you were a medic, you had to crawl through the mud, dodging bullets while trying to drag soldiers to safety. And sometimes, the men you tried to save didn't even make it. One moment, you're dragging a soldier back to the trenches. The next, a shell lands next to you and he's gone. And even when you did save someone, it didn't always matter. Because the war wasn't just about bullets, it was about gas. And once mustard gas hit, no one was safe. Most soldiers only had to focus on staying alive. But medics? They had to watch men die, over and over again, every single day. They saw things no human should ever see. Men missing half their faces, screaming for their mothers. Soldiers begging for a quick death because the pain was too much to handle. And here's the thing. There was no such thing as mental health support back then. If you started breaking down, if you couldn't take it anymore, the Army didn't help you. They just sent you back onto the battlefield. Some medics tried to block it out. Others just shut down completely. After the war, many of them suffered from what we now call PTSD. But back then, it was just called shell shock. And if you couldn't function, the Army didn't care. Because to them, you were replaceable. But even for the medics who made it home, the war never really left them. After the war, soldiers were treated as heroes. Medics, not so much. They weren't seen as warriors. They weren't given medals. Many of them returned home with severe trauma, missing limbs, or diseases from the trenches. The men they saved? Many of them didn't even remember their names. And the worst part? The nightmares never stopped. Some medics spent the rest of their lives haunted by the screams of the dying. Others couldn't handle the guilt, knowing they had to choose who lived and who died because there just weren't enough hands to save everyone. So yeah, being a medic in World War I, it sucked. You weren't just a doctor. You were a lifeline in a war that was designed to kill everyone in its path. If you found this story insane, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments which forgotten part of history should we cover next.